This is ISM, Season 2, The Age of Anarchism, Chicago and the American Labor Revolt. Ideas meet power. Prologue, One Big Union, Chicago, June 1905. Lucy Parsons sat at the front of Brands Hall. Boisterous chatter ricocheted off plaster walls, smoke rose toward wooden rafters. Through the din, she caught fragments of language: English, German, Czech, Italian, Spanish. Voices braided together in the heat. At the front of the hall stood a group familiar to Lucy through her decades of work among Chicago's workers. Eugene Debs, broad-browed, steady-eyed, a man who had defied the railroad barons and paid for it with prison bars. Mother Jones, small, severe, unyielding, who had walked through Chicago's Great Fire and then into the coal fields, into the mills, and into the lives of miners' wives and factory children. These were not dreamers. They were veterans. Lucy's attention shifted as a massive figure moved across the platform. His shoulders strained against a dark suit. A black Western hat shadowed the glass eye that never blinked. She had seen that frame before, in photographs from Colorado, from mining camps turned into battlegrounds. William Big Bill Haywood bent down, lifted a scrap of wood from the floor, and mounted the podium. He struck the board once, twice. 5 sharp cracks split the room as silence rolled outward. "Fellow workers," he growled, voice low and steady. "This is the Continental Congress of the working class." The words landed heavy. Cheers surged, boots thudded against the floorboards, but Haywood rapped the board again. "We are here to confederate the workers of this country into a working class movement. The emancipation of the working class from the slave bondage of capitalism, the possession of economic power." All day, the rhythm continued with speeches, applause, argument, and conviction. Union men from the mines and railroads, socialists, anarchists, and women organizers from the streets of New York, Philadelphia, and Chicago. They did not agree on everything, but they did agree that while scattered, they had been crushed, and while divided, they had been defeated. By nightfall, their resolve hardened into words. The preamble of their Constitution declared, "The working class and the employing class have nothing in common. There can be no peace so long as hunger and want are found among millions of working people, and the few who make up the employing class have all the good things of life." On the second and third days, Lucy rose to speak. "We are here because we had eyes to see the misery," she began, her voice measured but cutting. "We had ears to hear the cry of the downcast and miserable of the earth. We had a heart that was sympathetic." A cheer rolled through the crowd. "Remember that we are here as one brotherhood, one sisterhood, as one humanity. It matters not under what flag or in what country they happen to be born." Applause swelled and hats lifted. Lucy lifted her hand, and the noise thinned into a murmur. "These conventions are full of enthusiasm, and that is right. But when you go out of this hall, when you have laid aside your enthusiasm, then comes the solid work." The murmur faded as hundreds of faces leaned forward. "Are you prepared to meet organized capital with the millions at its command? It has many weapons to fight us: money, law, armories, and lastly, the gallows." Now the hall was still. "I am not here to discourage," she continued, steady and unblinking, "but to encourage this organization to be built not upon sand, but upon a strong granite hard foundation." The creak of a pew echoed in the front, a muffled cough in the back. "We must take possession of this earth through the general strike," Lucy declared. "But the strike of the future is not to go out and starve, but to strike and remain in and take possession of the necessary property of production." The words hung in the smoke-filled air as the hall looked on in silence. They had heard anger and they had heard hope, but what they heard now was a plan. for this was not the language of negotiation. It was the language of power. Hi, I'm Matt Payne. Welcome to ISM. This is What is Unionism? Building Power from Below. When Lucy Parsons spoke at Brands Hall that Chicago summer day in 1905, she had spent 3 decades struggling on behalf of the hungry, the desperate, and the downtrodden. By the end of that Congress, Lucy would help found a new organization, the Industrial Workers of the World, whose radical program of revolutionary industrial unionism would reshape the labor movement for years to come and inspire workers from New York to London, from Chile to Australia. The IWW, or the Wobblies, as they would soon be known, brought together some of the most seasoned labor leaders of the late 19th century. Big Bill Haywood, Eugene Debs, Mother Jones, Lucy Parsons, peoples whose struggles had, each in their own way, convinced them that the labor movement needed to take a radically new direction. By the turn of the 20th century, industrial capitalism had fundamentally reorganized economic life in the United States. Factories, railroads, and mines now employed thousands of workers at a time, while ownership of these vast enterprises rested in the hands of only a few men. Yet even as industry had become centralized and consolidated, the labor movement remained fragmented, organized largely by craft, trade, and skill. The largest and most powerful labor organization in the United States was the American Federation of Labor, the AFL. Through decades of organization and collective bargaining, the AFL, under the leadership of the cigar maker Samuel Gompers, had won significant gains for its members. But those members came from a relatively narrow slice of the working class, skilled workers who were, almost without exception, white and male. Women, African Americans, and many immigrants, especially those arriving from Southern and Eastern Europe or from Asia, were routinely excluded from AFL unions. Gompers defended these exclusions by arguing that unions should organize skilled labor first, where workers possessed the greatest bargaining power. To many radicals, however, this approach left the vast majority of workers divided and therefore weak. Nowhere was this more apparent than in the mines of the American West. Big Bill Haywood, who presided over the founding convention of the Wobblies, had worked the hard rock mines since the age of 15. For decades, he stood on the front line of labor's most brutal struggles. His union, the Western Federation of Miners, had fought bitter battles with mine owners during the so-called Colorado labor wars of the 1890s and early 1900s, when strikes were met with violent repression from the state militias, the National Guard, and private detective agencies such as the Pinkertons. These conflicts hardened Western labor leaders like Big Bill Haywood. They came to believe that workers could never defeat the organized power of capital if they remained divided by trade or skill. To make matters worse, Samuel Gompers and the AFL had repeatedly refused strike aid to Colorado miners. Haywood responded with a bitter joke. The American Federation of Labor, he said, had become nothing more than the American Separation of Labor. Another critic of the AFL was Eugene V. Debs. Gene, as he was known, began working on the railroads of Illinois at the age of 14. Starting as a shop laborer cleaning grease from locomotive parts, he eventually rose to the position of fireman. Unlike many radicals of his generation, Debs came from a relatively stable middle-class background, and for much of his early career he held moderate views about labor relations. He often opposed strikes, believing that cooperation between capital and labor could produce gradual improvements for workers. But even as a moderate voice calling for conciliation, Debs remained a fierce advocate for working people. By the early 1890s, he had begun to question whether the craft system of the AFL could ever unite railroad workers against the immense power of the railroad corporations. Engineers, conductors, brakemen, switchmen each belonged to separate craft brotherhoods, and each negotiated with the companies independently. Debs began to believe that the railroads, which were increasingly controlled by powerful monopolies, required a different kind of labor organization, one that could stand up to the vast railroad empires, which stretched across thousands of miles and employed workers from dozens of different trades. In 1893, he helped found the American Railway Union, one of the first attempts to organize railroad workers across crafts into a single industrial union. The ARU quickly demonstrated its potential when it won a major strike against James J. Hill's Great Northern Railroad. The victory of the Great Northern Railroad strike electrified railroad workers across the country. Membership surged and confidence grew. But this early success also brought new pressures. Debs urged patience and consolidation, but events began moving faster than the young union could control. In May of 1894, workers at the Pullman Palace Car Company outside Chicago launched a strike after wage cuts and rising rents in the company town. Within weeks, the conflict escalated into one of the most dramatic labor battles in American history. Railroad workers across the country began refusing to handle Pullman cars, effectively launching a massive boycott that paralyzed rail traffic across much of the United States. At its height, hundreds of thousands of workers were involved, a strike that in scale rivaled the Great Railroad Strike of 1877. The Pullman Strike of 1894, which we will explore further later in this series, placed Eugene Debs and the Young American Railway Union directly against one of the most powerful corporate and political alliances in the country. Debs called for solidarity across the rail system, but the boycott faced opposition from multiple directions. Samuel Gompers and the AFL refused to support the strike, while the established railroad brotherhoods, representing the most skilled engineers and conductors, also declined to participate. Without their support, the government moved decisively. Federal troops were deployed, courts issued sweeping injunctions against the union, and the confrontation spiraled into the most explosive labor crisis of the decade. Debs himself was arrested for violating the court order and sentenced to prison. The experience transformed him, forcing Debs to rethink everything he believed about the relationship between labor, capital, and the American state. The defeats of the 1890s convinced many organizers, including Debs and Haywood, that neither craft unions nor political reform alone could solve the problem of worker power. The lessons of Pullman and Colorado were clear. As long as workers remained divided by trade or skill, they would remain vulnerable to the unified power of capital and the state. So, in 1905, these labor leaders gathered in Chicago to try something new. Haywood had tried to unite all miners. Debs had attempted to unite all railroad workers. Now they set out to unite all workers, regardless of industry, craft, skill, race, or gender, into what they called one big union. But the idea of organizing workers across trades was not entirely new. Lucy Parsons had encountered it more than 20 years earlier. In the early 1880s, while organizing in Chicago alongside her husband Albert, Lucy joined the city's section of the Knights of Labor, an organization that, long before the Wobblies, had attempted to bring the entire working class into one single movement. Interlude: The Embryo, Chicago, 1885. Albert Parsons felt the energy of 1877 rising again. Across the crowded hall, he saw Lucy passing out flyers to a group of seamstresses. Beside them, Lizzie Holmes spoke urgently about the need for women to organize alongside men. Lucy caught Albert's eye, flashed a quick grin, and returned to her work. Toward the back of the room, August Spiess was deep in conversation with a group of German cabinet makers and upholsterers. The newspaper in his hand shook as he spoke, its title printed in bold black letters, Arbeiter Zeitung. Nearby, Czech lumber shovers and Irish butchers debated the demand that had begun to spread across the city, the 8-hour workday. Albert glanced down at the paper in his own hand, the latest issue of The Alarm. Lucy's article stared back at him. Our civilization, is it worth saving? He flipped the page to his own editorial, the argument he had been shaping for years. He read the words once more. The trades union is the embryonic group of the future free society. Every trades union is, nolens volens, an autonomous commune in the process of incubation. For the first time, the idea felt real. The Central Labor Union was growing. Knights of Labor assemblies were multiplying across the city. Workers from dozens of trades and dozens of countries were finally beginning to organize together. The Knights were imperfect. Parsons knew that. But somewhere inside this movement, this messy, crowded brotherhood of workers, he could see the outline of something new, the embryo of a future society. And in the crowded halls of Chicago, that embryo was now beginning to grow. In the early 1880s, Chicago emerged as the epicenter of the American labor movement. The city was home to some of the nation's fastest-growing industries: meatpacking, lumber, grain processing, and the sprawling rail yards that connected the continent. These industries drew in thousands of laborers from across the world. Between 1880 and 1890, Chicago's population more than doubled, and nearly 80% of its residents were either foreign-born or the children of immigrants. This rapidly growing and diverse workforce posed a problem for the existing labor movement. Up to that point, most workers had organized into craft unions. Printers with printers, brewers with brewers, dockworkers with dockworkers, railroad switchmen with other switchmen. But Chicago's massive industrial workplaces did not divide neatly along those lines. Factories, packing houses, and rail yards employed hundreds, sometimes thousands of workers performing different tasks under a single employer. And as machinery spread and the division of labor deepened, employers could easily replace skilled workers with cheaper, less trained labor. So craft unions suddenly looked fragile. This created a situation in which workers performing different jobs in the same workplace shared the same conditions, but belonged to entirely separate unions, or to no union at all. Employers, by contrast, were increasingly organized and coordinated. For labor organizers, the question became unavoidable. How could workers build power from below in an industrial economy increasingly dominated by monopolies and by giant corporations? One of the first organizations to attempt an answer was the Knights of Labor. The Knights of Labor were originally founded in 1869 as a secret brotherhood of craftsmen, complete with elaborate initiation rituals modeled after those of the Freemasons. But in the wake of the Great Railroad Strike of 1877, the organization expanded rapidly beyond its origins. By the mid-1880s, the Knights claimed nearly 1 million members, making them the largest labor organization in the United States. Unlike most unions of the time, the Knights attempted to organize workers across trades. Skilled and unskilled laborers joined its ranks, as did women, immigrants, and black workers, an unusually inclusive membership for the era. One major exception, however, was Chinese workers, who were excluded from the organization throughout its existence. The Knights' relative openness reflected the philosophy of their young leader, Terence V. Powderly. Powderly was influenced by a current of thought historians often describe as producerism, the belief that those who produced wealth through labor were the true foundation of society, in contrast to those who profited from speculation or inheritance. Because of this outlook, the Knights did not initially view the conflict between workers and employers as irreconcilable. Like the young Eugene Debs, Powderly opposed strikes whenever possible, believing they damaged both workers and employers who were, in his view, fellow producers. Instead, Powderly envisioned the Knights primarily as a movement for worker uplift and education, one that would eventually replace the wage system with a cooperative commonwealth. But the Knights' loose structure made it difficult to control the actions of local assemblies. One such assembly was the one that emerged in Chicago under the leadership of Albert Parsons and the Cooper George Schilling. Parsons was drawn to the Knights because they seemed to embody his vision of a grand labor brotherhood, uniting workers of all races and nationalities. Lucy Parsons soon joined as well after the organization opened its membership to women. Together, the Parsons helped expand the Knights' presence across the city, organizing printers, dockworkers, brewers, seamstresses, iron molders, clerks, and the unemployed into the growing movement. For radicals in Chicago, the broad and inclusive structure of the Knights offered an innovative model, a way to organize workers across trades, industries, and ethnic communities in a city defined by massive factories and an extraordinarily diverse workforce. Yet even as the Knights grew, Chicago's labor movement remained deeply divided. Skilled workers often belonged to craft unions affiliated with citywide trades assemblies, while many unskilled laborers remained completely outside organized labor. Throughout the 1880s, the Parsons worked tirelessly to unite workers across these divides. Then their opportunity finally arrived when workers across the city's factories, rail yards, and workshops began rallying around a single demand: the 8-hour workday. The 8-hour movement, which will be the focus of our next episode, would culminate on May 1st, 1886, when nearly 500,000 workers across the United States walked off the job demanding shorter hours, a strike that would in later years inspire the birth of May Day. And at the center of this upheaval stood Chicago, which saw both the largest strikes and the most radical demands. For organizers like the Parsons, August Spiess, and Lizzie Holmes, the 8-hour movement represented more than a simple demand for shorter hours. It was a test. Could workers from different trades, industries, and nations act together as a single force? In many ways, the movement pointed toward an idea that the industrial workers of the world would crystallize 2 decades later: revolutionary industrial unionism. The idea that workers must organize across entire industries and use their collective power to shut down production, challenge the wage system, and ultimately replace capitalism itself. Yet, on a national level, 1886 would also inaugurate a rapid decline for the Knights of Labor. In March of that year, a local division of the Knights in Marshall, Texas, launched a strike on the Great Southwest Railroad after one of their members was fired for attending a union meeting. The railroad was owned by the powerful magnate Jay Gould, one of the most notorious figures of the Gilded Age, and derided by his enemies as among the worst of the robber barons. The strike spread rapidly. Within a week, nearly 200,000 workers across Arkansas, Kansas, Missouri, Illinois, and Texas had halted rail traffic. It was the largest strike since the Great Railroad Strike of 1877, and it placed the Knights of Labor in direct confrontation with Gould's vast railroad empire. But the strike exposed a fundamental weakness in the Knights' strategy. More skilled railroad unions, particularly the Brotherhood of Engineers and Trainmen, refused to support the strike and instructed their members to continue working. Without their participation, the strike faltered, allowing Gould to bring in strikebreakers and resume operations. Throughout the strike, violence remained relatively limited, though tensions did erupt in the rail yards of East St. Louis, where armed guards fired into a crowd of strikers, killing 6 workers. Soon, state authorities intervened. Missouri militia units, Texas Rangers, and private Pinkerton agents were deployed to restore order. By early May, the strike had collapsed. The defeat of the Great Southwest Railroad strike marked the first major blow to the Knights of Labor. In the months that followed, especially after the Haymarket Affair, which we will return to in 2 episodes, and which occurred the very day the strike ended, public opinion turned sharply against the organization. Membership began to collapse, and out of this crisis, a different model of unionism quickly emerged. In December 1886, Samuel Gompers and a coalition of craft unions formed the American Federation of Labor. The defeats of that year convinced many labor leaders that large mass strikes and attempts to organize across entire industries were too dangerous and too unstable. Instead, the AFL focused on organizing skilled workers into smaller craft unions, capable of negotiating directly with employers. By 1890, Gompers summarized the AFL's philosophy as pure and simple unionism, an approach that prioritized practical economic gains such as higher wages, shorter hours, and improved working conditions over political reform or revolutionary social change. In some ways, Gompers arrived at this position through experiences not entirely unlike those of more radical organizers like Albert and Lucy Parsons. Like them, Gompers had witnessed the power of the state to intervene on behalf of powerful economic interests. But the lessons he drew from those experiences were very different. While Albert Parsons faced blacklisting and violent threats because of his political activism, Gompers encountered the limits of reform in a different way. As a leader in the Cigar Makers Union in New York, he had helped push for state laws regulating cigar manufacturing, only to see the New York Supreme Court strike those laws down. Both Gompers and the Parsons came to believe that legislative reform offered only fragile protection for workers. Laws could be overturned, ignored, or reshaped to favor the wealthy. But from that shared realization, they drew sharply different conclusions. Gompers concluded that workers should focus on direct economic bargaining with employers and support whichever political candidates were sympathetic to labor, regardless of party affiliation. The Parsons, by contrast, would eventually reject electoral politics entirely. By the end of the century, the AFL had grown dramatically, representing more than 500,000 skilled workers. Through their practical approach of negotiating with employers and accepting the continued growth of industrial capitalism, AFL unions secured tangible gains that improved the lives of hundreds of thousands of workers. Yet the success of this strategy carried limits. Because AFL unions largely excluded unskilled laborers, their victories benefited only a narrow segment of the working class. Over time, this group came to be described by critics, the Parsons among them, as a labor aristocracy. In the United States, that aristocracy was overwhelmingly white and male, as many AFL locals routinely barred women, African Americans, and large numbers of immigrant laborers. So while pure and simple unionism produced real gains for some workers, it left the majority of the working class outside its ranks, the unskilled, the immigrant, and the poor. And it was precisely those workers whom radicals like Lucy Parsons, Eugene Debs, and Big Bill Haywood believed must be organized if labor was ever to challenge the power of capital. So, when the IWW held its inaugural Congress in Chicago in 1905, they were not only returning to a city, they were returning to an idea. In the face of repression and the growing dominance of the AFL's exclusive craft unionism, what anarchists had once called the Chicago idea had lain dormant for nearly 2 decades. But now it resurfaced. The belief that workers across trades, industries, and nations could organize themselves into a single fighting force, could unite into one big union. An organization capable not only of winning reforms, but of serving as the embryo of a future free society. At the founding of the IWW in 1905, Lucy Parsons would articulate a method for bringing this new society into being. The general strike, a strategy first inspired by the 8-hour movement of 1886, when Lucy, alongside hundreds of thousands of others across the nation, participated in the largest strike in American history up to that point. A strike in which workers across geography, trade, and nationality acted together to demand better conditions. And so, after their founding Congress in 1905, the Wobblies went out to begin what Parsons called the solid work, organizing, educating, and resisting with the ultimate goal of taking possession of this earth through the general strike. In the years that followed, this effort would carry the Wobblies into battles across the continent. Some of those battles were fought in the factories and mines of the nation's major cities. Others were fought in the fields and forests of the West. One of the most famous would begin in Spokane, Washington, where a group of Wobblies began holding street meetings among itinerant workers, and where they soon found themselves at the center of one of the most dramatic fights for free speech in American history. Interlude: The Rebel Girl. Under a government which imprisons any unjustly, the true place for a just man is also a prison. Henry David Thoreau, Civil Disobedience. Spokane, Washington, 1909. Elizabeth Gurley Flynn breathed in the dry western air and looked out toward the purple mountains rising beyond wooden storefronts. She had stood on that street corner for weeks now, but the view never seemed to grow old. The crowd was larger than usual that morning. Hundreds of overalls, straw hats, and bundled blankets moved through the street like a restless river. Men, women, boys, and girls, all recent arrivals, all desperate for work. Flynn rested one hand on the swell beneath her coat. The men worried the police might throw her in jail, but she had no intention of leaving. The days had begun to fall into a familiar rhythm, almost a ritual. Workers gathered in the square. A Wobbly climbed onto the crate and began reading from the Declaration of Independence or the Bill of Rights, warning the crowd that the employment sharks waiting in town would cheat them of their wages. Some days she spoke. Some days she watched as another Wobbly climbed onto the box. Her older comrades liked to joke about it. "Gurley'll have that baby on the platform if she's not careful." Soon enough, the police would arrive. They'd drag away a handful of Wobblies, and the next day, the whole thing would begin again. Dozens had been arrested, but the police had still never touched her, almost certainly because the mayor knew it would look bad to throw a 19-year-old pregnant girl into jail. Still, Flynn could see they were beginning to understand that she was probably the most dangerous one out there. She glanced down the street and spotted more Wobblies than the day before. The call printed in the Industrial Worker had clearly worked. She had helped write the headline: "Quit your job, go to Spokane, fight with the lumberjacks for free speech." The shopkeepers watched from their doorways. At first, they had sneered, demanding the Wobblies leave town. Now they simply looked tired. The jails were full. The city had already turned the firehouse into a holding pen, and still the Wobblies kept coming. Flynn knew they were getting close. She had seen the same thing happen the year before in Missoula. Once the taxpayers began to grumble, it was only a matter of time before the mayor gave in. But that day would prove different. When she finished reciting the First Amendment, a police officer stepped forward, grabbed her wrist, and snapped on a pair of handcuffs, citing the charge of criminal conspiracy, the same she had faced in Missoula. It was the third time Flynn had been arrested, but the townspeople shouting at the officers did not know that. Flynn spent only one night in the county jail, but what she saw there shocked her. Men covered in blood were crammed into a basement cell where horse manure from the stables above dripped down through the floorboards. She saw men with broken jaws, missing teeth, blackened eyes, and torn clothes. Boys suffering from scurvy, malnutrition, and disease. The women's ward was less crowded and less bloody, but their hardship came in another way. Throughout the night, women were led out of the cell by guards. Flynn overheard one guard complain that he would have brought Jack up here for only her being here. Elizabeth assumed the her was a 19-year-old pregnant girl. When she was released the next morning, Flynn walked straight to the Wobbly headquarters. The newspapers had already called her one of the most dangerous IWWs. Now she intended to prove them right. She set her mind to showing the world what was happening inside the jails of Spokane. The fight waged by Elizabeth Gurley Flynn and the Wobblies over free speech would become one of the most enduring victories of the IWW's early years. It showed that the legacy of revolutionary industrial unionism extended far beyond strikes and boycotts. Flynn herself would later become a prominent leader within the American Civil Liberties Union, ACLU, the organization that would emerge as one of the most important defenders of free speech and other civil liberties in the United States. Roger Baldwin, who served as director of the ACLU for more than 3 decades, had once been a Wobbly himself, and later reflected on the role of the IWW played in the struggles for civil liberties. He wrote that the Wobblies, quote, wrote a chapter in the history of American liberties like that of the struggle of the Quakers, of the militant suffragists, and of the abolitionists. The IWW blazed the trail in those 10 years of fighting for free speech. But how did a militant revolutionary union come to stand at the forefront of the American struggle for free speech? To answer that question, we have to return to the IWW's founding in Chicago in 1905. Despite the revolutionary rhetoric of its founders, the years immediately following the IWW's first convention were defined as much by internal conflict and repression as by organizing victories. From an institutional perspective, the IWW represented an ambitious attempt to unite 2 of the most important industrial unions in the United States, Eugene Debs's American Railway Union and Big Bill Haywood's Western Federation of Miners. But just 6 months after the IWW's founding, the former governor of Idaho, Frank Steunenberg, was assassinated by a miner and former member of the Western Federation of Miners. Haywood and several other WFM leaders were arrested and placed at the center of one of the most sensational trials in American history. Little evidence connected Haywood or the Union leadership to the assassination. And to make matters worse for the prosecution, it soon emerged that the assassin had once been a paid informant for the Mine Owners Association. Haywood was defended by Clarence Darrow, the famed lawyer who had earlier represented Eugene Debs. Through Darrow's skillful defense, Haywood was acquitted. But the trial nevertheless had lasting consequences for the young IWW. The Western Federation of Miners gradually drifted away from the organization and began moving toward a more conventional form of industrial unionism. Haywood himself, however, emerged from the trial as a national figure. Despite his radical reputation, he attracted widespread sympathy from workers across the country. For some Americans, the IWW now appeared as a movement defending the dispossessed. For others, though, it looked like a dangerous conspiracy threatening the foundations of society. Even with this increased notoriety, the IWW continued to struggle from an institutional perspective. Leadership frequently changed, and the organization's decentralized structure made it difficult to build a stable national union. But for many Wobblies, this decentralization was not a flaw, but part of its design. The IWW must be understood, above all, through the people it sought to organize. Workers largely ignored by mainstream labor organizations, like Samuel Gompers' American Federation of Labor. These included the itinerant workers of the American West, who cut timber, worked seasonal harvests, or built railroads and temporary construction projects. They also included Eastern and Southern European immigrants, Jews, Catholics, African Americans, Mexicans, Asian Americans, and women. Many of these workers lived with constant insecurity. Low wages, seasonal employment, frequent displacement, and little protection from employers or the law. In many ways, they were the most excluded members of America's working class, and they often carried deep grievances against the system that exploited them. The character and demographic of these workers shaped the culture of the organization itself. The IWW developed a radical form of unionism that drew from many different traditions, including anarchism, socialism, syndicalism, and eventually communism. Unlike most unions of the time, Wobbly locals had no closed membership rolls or apprenticeship barriers. As one organizer explained, "One man is as good as another to me. I don't care whether he is black, blue, green, or yellow, as long as he acts the man and acts true to his economic interests as a worker." With this welcoming approach, thousands of the country's most marginalized workers joined the IWW because it offered many of them the first real opportunity they had ever been given to organize and fight back. In a labor movement long divided by race, skill, gender, and nationality, the Wobblies embraced a far more radical idea of solidarity. The Wobblies also believed that solidarity meant more than simple membership in a union. It meant a willingness to defy unjust laws and to confront the combined power of employers and the state. It was this radical inclusiveness, combined with a persistent willingness to confront the forces of state and capital, that would become the IWW's most enduring legacy. And no figure better represents that legacy than Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, the so-called rebel girl. Flynn came from a politically active Irish immigrant family. She delivered her first public speech on socialism in New York when she was just 16 years old. She soon joined the IWW and quickly became a full-time organizer, agitating among garment workers in Pennsylvania, silk workers in New Jersey, restaurant workers in New York, and miners in Minnesota. The novelist Theodore Dreiser once described her as the East Side Joan of Arc. Her work with the Wobblies eventually brought her west to Missoula, Montana, and Spokane, Washington. There, she and other Wobblies attempted to organize itinerant workers, but found their efforts blocked by local ordinances that banned street speaking and by constant harassment from the police. In response, the Wobblies developed a novel tactic where they would flood towns with organizers who deliberately violated the speech ordinances, often by simply reading the Declaration of Independence or the Bill of Rights aloud, knowing they would be arrested. Their goal was simple: to fill the jails faster than the authorities could manage them. Police would arrest dozens one day, only to find dozens more arriving the next. One exasperated officer in Spokane reportedly complained, "Hell, we got the leaders, but damned if it don't look like they're all leaders." The 19-year-old Flynn was herself arrested in Missoula and again in Spokane while several months pregnant. She later wrote about the brutality she witnessed in jail in order to expose the treatment of Wobbly prisoners and to bring public pressure on local authorities to abandon their restrictions on free speech. The tactic proved remarkably effective. Across the American West, city governments eventually repealed their speech bans once overflowing jails and mounting costs began to anger taxpayers. As the industrial worker proudly declared, the Wobblies had forced authorities to recognize something remarkable, saying, quote, "By use of its weakest weapon, passive resistance, labor forced civic authorities to recognize a power equal to the state." In the years that followed, the IWW would stand at the center of some of the most dramatic labor struggles in American history, including the Lawrence textile strike of 1912, where immigrant workers speaking dozens of different languages united under the banner of one big union. The IWW would later decline under the weight of repression during World War I and the Red Scare. But the ideas it championed would not disappear. The industrial unionism the Wobblies had long fought for would shape the rise of the Congress of Industrial Organizations, CIO, which during the New Deal era of the 1930s brought millions of factory workers into unions for the first time. And the organization remains a part of the nation's largest union, the AFL-CIO, which today represents nearly 15 million workers. And then the tactics the IWW pioneered during its early years, such as mass solidarity, nonviolent resistance, and the willingness to confront unjust laws, would influence social movements for decades to come, from the sit-down strikes of the 1930s labor movement to the civil rights campaigns of the 1950s and 60s, to modern struggles for economic justice in the 21st century. But along with such tactics, the Wobblies also passed down an important lesson, learned through decades of struggle. The lesson that if workers were ever to wield a power equal to the state, they would first have to confront the institutions that protected the power of capital. And it was in Chicago that anarchist organizers like Lucy Parsons first tested the power of that idea. Because nowhere was the confrontation between labor and capital more explosive than in Chicago in the 1880s, when workers across the city began to rally around a single demand: the 8-hour workday. And so, in our next 2 episodes, we will return to the heart of America's labor movement, where Albert and Lucy Parsons, August Spiess, and Lizzie Holmes joined thousands of workers to demand shorter hours and higher pay. And it was this moment in 1886 when Chicago quickly became the epicenter of a nationwide strike, once again revealing the extraordinary power workers possessed to bring the machinery of the American economy to a halt. So join me next time as we return to Chicago 1886 for the fight for the 8-hour workday, and then for the event that would transform the labor movement and send shockwaves through the entire nation: the Haymarket Affair.
Mais je l'ai bien cru, les temps des séries, où l'on s'en vêtait, qu'il m'aurait fondu pendant de Cerise d'Hermont, et rose appareil, tout bon sur les mous, sans goutte de sang. Mais je l'ai bien cru, les temps de série, pendant de
Ism is written and produced by me, Matt Payne. The original musical score is composed by Ian Payne. Our theme song is performed by Aloe Vera on vocals and banjo, with accompaniment from Ian and myself. If you're curious how I build these narrative scenes, where I source the quotes, what lines are verbatim, altered, or composed to capture the essence of a moment, you'll find full transcripts, suggested readings, show notes, and behind-the-scenes looks at my process on the Ism Substack. If you would like to support on Patreon, you can find me at patreon.com/ismhistorypodcast. Both links are in the episode description. To learn more about Ian's work, you'll also find his website there. And if you'd like to reach out, you can email me at ismhistorypodcast@gmail.com. Thanks so much for listening, and I will see you next time.